Niemals zuvor hat die Kunstgeschichte eine so spannende und
Never before did art history go through such a thrilling and exciting development as at the beginning of our century. The film you are now watching will try to trace the life and evolution of a man whose creative power, and above all his feeling for design, played a major part in the shaping of the aesthetic perception and aesthetic understanding of our century. Whole generations of architects and designers made him their role model, and for many he still is today. We are talking about the artistic phenomenon of Josef Hoffmann. You're invited to join us in a detailed journey through that eventful time at the beginning of our century, which became part of and influenced art history. Together, let us try to follow this story's thread. It should bring us nearer the cultural developments of the past, make them understandable, and, this is the most important, make us aware of today's cultural developments. But to start, the question: who exactly was the legendary Josef Hoffmann?
Wer war denn eigentlich nun wirklich, der legendäre Josef Hoffmann?
If we want to know more about this fascinating personality and the fertile nature of his creativity, we will have to try to dig down to the roots and describe the cultural currents of the end of the 19th century. In today's Czechoslovakia, above all in Bohemia and Moravia, the effects of the Industrial Revolution were noticeable earlier and stronger than in the other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hoffmann came from this region, born in 1870 in Pirnitz in Moravia. This put him alongside many creative minds who enriched the cultural and economic life of Vienna at the turn of the century. As of 1887, he visited the Technical College in Brno, where he studied the methods of classical architecture. After his practical year in Würzburg as a student of architecture, Hoffmann studied from 1892 at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, built by Theophil Hansen. His teacher, Karl Freiherr von Hasenauer, was then at the height of his popularity due to his Ringstrasse buildings. After his death, Otto Wagner, the most famous architect of the end of the 19th century and pioneer of the modern, took over the class.
Wenn man versucht, die komplexe Abfolge von künstlerischen Strömungen in den
If one tries to piece together the complex list of trends in the arts in the last centuries, one ends up with three guiding principles. Firstly, the ever more forcibly declared wish to tear down all links with the traditional, and from then on, to present oneself as completely modern. Then the second guiding principle, the ever-growing interest in international art currents. One made an effort to look at oneself as European. And thirdly, artist groups were formed almost as political parties, organizing themselves and declaring their intentions loudly, and they often disagreed with one another.
Im wahrsten Sinne des Wortes in lebendigstem Widerspruch sich befunden haben.
After Hoffmann demonstratively left the Künstlerhaus with a number of like-minded colleagues including Gustav Klimt and Kolo Moser, the Sensation was founded in 1897, the organization of graphic artists. The new organization's home, built by Josef Maria Olbrich, offered the young Hoffmann, as organizer of the exhibitions, ideal opportunity to present himself to an art-loving, progressive and financially well-endowed circle of potential clients. The society of this time seemed to show, as never before, an interest in art. The conventional salons, academies and the like very quickly lost their influence, as the modern questions the authority of the traditional. The art of this time saw itself as a stimulus of the contemporary consciousness. If one takes a look at Hoffmann's works from this time, one can clearly identify the influence of the school of Wagner, which determined the structure of an object through the emphasis on the surface. While the Belgian Art Nouveau influenced the Secessionists, it was also important for Hoffmann. Already in 1899, Hoffmann's name was so well known that he was appointed professor at the Viennese School of Applied Arts. At the beginning of 1900, a basic change of style is noticeable. With the turning away from the curves and sweeps of the Secession and Art Nouveau, a turn towards simpler forms took place. During this very important phase of development, Hoffmann was commissioned to build a colony of villas on the Hohe Warte Hill in Vienna. Hoffmann was a close friend of the Secession's building contractors, and this gave him the chance to design houses that suited both his and the builder's ideal. This was to reach a unity both outside and inside the house, or, in Hoffmann's own words, to build a house whose exterior is at one with its interior. With the interior design, Hoffmann's transformation is even more noticeable. Here, he moves away from the Secession and, for the first time, he reveals his own unmistakable and independent style. The interior of the houses still existing today are no longer in their original state, even though some have been lovingly adapted to suit today's requirements. Hoffmann's turn away from the sweeping curves of Art Nouveau and his turn towards simpler forms has to be seen in the historic context, with the move away from the floral Jugendstil, which set in around 1900 in Europe and went hand in hand with a renaissance of classical ideals. At this time, British examples had a special influence on Hoffmann. His admiration for the latest developments in architecture and applied arts in Britain is easy to explain. On the one hand, numerous illustrated magazines allowed for an avid exchange of information. On the other hand, there were a number of Secession exhibitions where British artists such as Ashby and Mackintosh took part. Along with the houses on the Hohe Warte, Hoffmann was commissioned with the interior decoration of a number of Viennese apartments. At that time, he was Vienna's fashionable architect, and his works were unrivaled worldwide. They were so revolutionary that one can rightfully argue that a new era had begun. In later years, Hoffmann explained his developing interest at this time in the square and the use of black and white by saying that these clear elements had never been incorporated in previous styles. During this prolific period, Hoffmann found solutions to problems which a decade later would come to be popularly accepted and understood as basic principles. The sculpture Superport en Relief was created by Hoffmann in 1902 for the 14th exhibition of the Secession. It's recognized as the final turning point towards a new feeling for design. Throughout the world, workshops started up with the aim to find new and contemporary forms, no longer wanting to follow the example of historical precedents. Using the fortune of the young industrialist and art lover Fritz Werndorfer, and with the enthusiasm and creative power of Josef Hoffmann and Kolo Moser, the Wiener Werkstaette, the Vienna Workshops, was founded in May 1903. A productive community of artists and craftsmen who were to make a deep impression on the life of Hoffmann as well as on the Viennese art scene.
Das Unternehmen Wiener Werkstätte hatte ganz klar
The undertaking Wiener Werkstätte had a clear aim: to make all facets of human life into one unified work of art. This began with the creation of, for that time extraordinarily, advanced working conditions for the craftsmen. And it ended with the wish to create everything entirely anew, whether or not it was needed for everyday use or should act as decoration. It was also decided only to approve objects of outstanding individuality and beauty, and great value was put on the exclusive and exquisite craftsmanship. This followed the organization's motto, better to work 10 days on one product than to manufacture 10 products in one day. The seat of the venture was in the Neustiftgasse 32 to 34, where a new building was adapted to their requirements. It would eventually exhaust Werndorfer's complete fortune. In the meantime, however, the enthusiasm with which the key figures threw themselves into their work was great.
It was from here that the Wiener Werkstaette operated,
The architect's office and the workshops. On the remaining photographs from that time, it all looks more impressive than it actually was. The Wiener Werkstaette definitely had economic problems from the beginning, and one can easily imagine what kind of financial success they had if one considers that it took them a year to adapt their offices, while at the same time building up their stock of goods.
Mit wirtschaftlichen Problemen zu kämpfen. Und dass die Wiener Werkstätte nach ihrer eigenen Darstellung etwa ein ganzes Jahr nur damit beschäftigt gewesen ist, die Geschäftsräume zu adaptieren und gleichsam auf Vorrat zu produzieren, dann können wir uns leicht ein Bild davon machen, wie es um ihren Erfolg bestellt war.
Through exhibitions and fairs, and along with the encouragement of a well-wishing press, the Wiener Werkstätte quickly gained an excellent and widespread reputation. But still it was not possible to make the undertaking self-sufficient and to become independent from supporters and financial backers. In any case, the idealism of a few people left us with a vast number of objects that, in their creative energy and in their diverse forms, have a place in art history which cannot be disputed. The duo Hoffmann and Moser complemented each other so well that for a time it was impossible to differentiate between their designs. Although one has to note that Moser's great talent for the surface art had a decisive influence on Hoffmann's creative activity, and that Hoffmann further developed Moser's many impulses into his own personal style. The circle of customers of the Wiener Werkstätte and Josef Hoffmann mainly consisted of artists and also of the open-minded, progressive and financially well-to-do Jewish upper-middle class of the monarchy. The first large assignment for Hoffmann and the Wiener Werkstätte, the erection and interior design of the Sanatorium Purkersdorf, came about through the acquaintance of the building contractor with the art critic Bertha Zuckerkandel. She, as an avid supporter of the Sensation and admirer of Josef Hoffmann, recommended him to the builder. The sanatorium was designed for a wealthy circle of patients to cater for the highest levels of comfort and luxury. Hoffmann made use of the most modern available techniques when building the Sanatorium Purkersdorf by constructing it in steel and concrete. His original plans show that he was inclined to take more radical advantage of this new construction technique than was actually possible in practice. Decoration was used sparingly on the building. As with the outside, so the inside is convincing, with its simplicity and boldness of concept and execution. Inside, there are fascinating contrasts between the severity of the architecture and the more abundantly treated interior. Certainly the intended purpose of the Sanatorium Purkersdorf called for a level of hygienic sobriety which helped Hoffmann in his design. The rooms are large in dimension and geometrically straightforward. In 1926, Leopold Bauer added another floor, against the architect's will, and thus robbed the building of its character. It was Aryanized during the Nazi period, and for a number of years after the war, it was used as an old people's home. In the 1960s, some of the furniture was thrown away, some was sold, and the building has since been neglected.
wird ja oft behauptet, dass böse Kunsthändler das Sanatorium Purkersdorf.
Today it is often claimed that wicked art dealers plundered the sanatorium Purkersdorf. But this is not quite true. Nobody was interested in Josef Hoffmann at the beginning of the 60s. And when I searched for an example of these famous chairs for my collection, the director told me all the chairs had already been thrown away. Then I asked the porter if he knew where one of the chairs could be. He told me that all of them were in the attic. They were all sold to me very cheaply, lock, stock and barrel. They were really not wanted. Sometime later, I offered these chairs to the international museums who bought them, Paris, London, New York. And this may have contributed to the fact that Josef Hoffmann became famous worldwide.
New York. Und das hat vielleicht dazu beigetragen, dass Josef Hoffmann in der Welt bekannt geworden ist.
Josef Hoffmann's most significant building is listed and under protection. However, even by the early 1990s, no funds have been found to renovate it. For Josef Hoffmann, the highest priority was hand finish of the highest quality.
Das ist halt das Wichtigste, dass alle Teile.
The final finish is the most important, that all parts are worthy of the same attention, and that it is attractive in its form. Today that is difficult. In Josef Hoffmann's time, however, labor costs were not so high. He wanted objects that stood for 100% quality, with every line being straight and perfect. The surface had to be worked evenly, with not even a tap of the hammer being too hard, whether it was visible at the front or hidden at the back of the article. That's because he was a perfectionist.
War ein Perfektionist.
Hoffmann, who worked with us until 1954, was often difficult because his projects were very complicated. But the finished products are very pleasing.
Aber auch dann viel Freude machten, wenn sie also fertig waren.
There have always been problems in the production of high-quality handcraft. Early on, Kolo Moser, before 1907 when he left the Wiener Werkstaette due to differences with Fritz Werndorfer, pointed out at every opportunity that an obsession for quality, joined with an immense range of goods, could hardly be supported by the paying public. It is the same today. Objects of the highest handcrafted finish can only be financed through other products. Most of the objects produced in the Wiener Werkstätte were stamped with a number of different hallmarks, with the trademark of the Wiener Werkstätte, the monogram of the designer, that of the craftsman who completed it, and an extra hallmark for silver. Surviving objects of this period are in part to be found in museums and partly in private collections. A small number are still available from art dealers and enjoy international acclaim.
Josef Hoffmann ist für unsere Generation doppelt bedeutend.
Josef Hoffmann is doubly important for our generation. Not only is he a master of stylistics, but he also has a dynamic approach to his projects. What particularly fascinates me about Josef Hoffmann is the intensity with which he creates small things, which are then used as the basis for the large scale. Thus, his buildings are derived from an obsessive attention to detail, an intense focus on the small contents of the construction, That means the interior, the chairs, his objects.
Die Einrichtung, das sind Stühle und das sind seine Objekte.
The Wiener Werkstaette had about 100 employees in 1905, 37 of whom were masters of their trade. Apart from Josef Hoffmann and Kolomoser, Otto Prutscher and Seo Czeska from about 1904, Eduard Wimmer-Viskrel and Berthold Löffler from 1907, and Dagobert Peschke from 1915 were responsible for designs, to name just the most important. Also freelance artists such as Gustav Klimt, Orlik, Hanak, Oskar Kokoschka and Egon Schiele worked for the Wiener Werkstätte.
Man muss sich vorstellen, dass erstens ein
One has to recognize that firstly, he was a true admirer of William Morris and saw culture stemming from the basis of art and crafts.
Also die wirkliche, würde ich sagen, Edelkultur.
Josef Hoffmann was a typical representative of the middle class of that period. It was the middle class, not the aristocracy, that was responsible for the real, I would say the noble culture of that time. And so Hoffmann wanted to bestow the best handcrafted and fantastic things on this noble culture.
Wollte die mit handwerklich besten, höchsten, fantastischen Dingen ausstatten. Daneben gab's aber auch
Alongside this was also the commodity culture. And he was of the opinion that the environment shouldn't be made up of millions of horrible, mass-produced things. He thus felt it was his duty to also make industry produce beautiful articles.
Umgeben wird, sondern dass eben auch für die Industrie verantwortlich ist, dass die schöne Gegenstände also erzeugt.
Between about 1904 and 1908, the Wiener Werkstätte had its own adjoining carpentry workshop. It had to be closed down as the noise level was too great for the neighbouring tenants. As a rule, the furniture of the Wiener Werkstätte was unsigned. Signed locks, characteristic keys and fittings, but above all the special signatures of each of the designers, as well as the outstanding workmanship and finish, are of considerable importance when attributing not easily identifiable objects. Hoffmann's significance as an early industrial designer for bentwood furniture can hardly be overestimated. For the firm Jacob and Josef Kuhn, he designed a furniture series which, through its simple forms, not only conformed to the requirements of an industrial finish, but also had a captivating, timeless elegance. Through vigorous exhibitioning, the firm Kuhn brought Hoffmann's furniture to an international public.
Zwischen 1902 und 1904 erreichte die puristische Phase.
Between 1902 and 1904, Hoffmann's purist phase reached its peak, and he concentrated solely on elementary forms. So much Spartan frugality often went against the wishes and intentions of his commissioners. They wanted to be able to recognize a bit of the old style in his new creations, something from the excess of historicism, from the richness of furnishings which matched their lifestyle.
Ihrem Lebensstil entsprochen hat. Und Hoffmanns künstlerische Fantasie konnte darauf reagieren.
And Hoffmann's artistic fantasy would later be able to react to this demand. Once he had moved on from his phase of ridding himself of historic weights, he was again prepared to let decorative elements flow into his work. After 1904, a number of projects were carried out where Hoffmann's search for simple form is clearly recognizable. But the choice of material and the painstaking work methods made the objects more splendid and opulent than in the previous years. The internationally accepted peak of Hoffmann's career is the Palais Stocklet, built in Brussels and still existing in its original form. Its dimension, quality and architectural significance was an accomplishment that was not to be surpassed throughout his long and fruitful career.
Die Geschichte werden Sie erkennen.
You will know the story. Baron Stocklet was on his honeymoon in Vienna, and he went for a walk on the Hohe Warte, where there are a number of Josef Hoffmann houses. He liked them so much that he apparently said, "I am going to stay in Vienna and build myself a house." He meant the area where the Asthaus now stands. And so it was planned. And then one day he came in and said that his father had died and that he would now have to build his big house in Brussels. That is how the Palais Stocklet came to be.
Das ich nie gesehen habe, ich weiß nicht, wie das ausschaut hat. Und eines Tages ist er gekommen und sagt, stellen Sie sich vor, mein Vater ist gestorben. Und jetzt bauen wir in Brüssel ein großes Haus, weil er steinreich nennt. Und so ist eigentlich das Stocklet-Haus entstanden.
Not only had material and techniques of manufacturing become more complicated, but also from 1905 a new change in direction in Hoffmann's creative work is recognizable, which can be seen as a return to classicism. One has to note, however, that Hoffmann always filtered the classical repertoire of form through his purest abstraction. All these tendencies were channeled into the building and, coupled with the considerable financial strength of Adolf Stocklet, resulted in probably Europe's most spectacular unified work of art of this epoch. When building the Palais Stocklet, the relationship between the commissioner and architect was the happiest imaginable, a fact which is clearly expressed in the consequent atmosphere and quality of the building, where obviously no compromises were made, neither with the outside finish nor with the interior. The real costs of the Palais Stocklet are not known, but, according to rumours, the artist's Cabaret Fledermaus of 1907 was a sort of byproduct of the Palais Stocklet. The same artists who worked on Stocklet were also involved in the design of the Fledermaus. Apart from Hoffmann, who was responsible for architecture and furnishing, many others, including Powolny, Löffler, Kokoschka, Klimt, Wimmer and Czeszka, worked on this project. The works of Hoffmann shortly before the First World War, by this time he had separated his architect's office from the Wiener Werkstaette, revealed an individual approach to classicism and ideally reflected the need for the representation of a social class whose days were already numbered due to political circumstances. Uninfluenced by socially aware critical trends concerning the role of the ornament in his time, Hoffmann was probably one of the few great architects of the 20th century who could emotionally grasp the relation between decoration and decorum as a real experience. The Villa Primavesi was Hoffmann's last great building before the First World War, whose outbreak put an end to any private building for a number of years.
Wien war ja schon immer ein Ort der Polaritäten und auch in den progressiven Strömungen.
Vienna has always been a place of polarities, and in the progressive movements there were very different and incompatible tendencies, which occasionally led to disputes. There was, of course, the parting of ways between Adolf Loos and Josef Hoffmann. And here one must note that very early on, and above all with the Sanatorium Purkersdorf, and later with the Palais Stocklet, Josef Hoffmann had produced masterpieces of the modern, which sparked off completely new developments.
Die Spitzenwerke der Moderne sind und die ganz neue Entwicklungen eingeleitet haben. In späterer Folge,
later on, and probably mainly under the influence of his colleagues at the Wiener Werkstätte, and also influenced by the significance of his own creation, he developed new inclinations, which were directed more towards the applied arts, as well as to the decorative.
Die wohl mehr dem kunstgewerblichen und auch dekorativen zugewandt war.
As of 1905, the Wiener Werkstätte produced hand-painted and printed silks. The Backhausen firm was responsible for the machine-printed and woven textiles. The diversity of the wares on offer from the Wiener Werkstätte was immense. As well as leather goods, there was enamel, jewellery, pearl embroidery, sheets of pictures, postcards, lace, fashions, ceramics, and yes, even a hat department. The time up to the liquidation of the Wiener Werkstätte and the auction of the stock in 1932 was influenced by a new generation of artists and craftsmen. The most important impulses came from Dagobert Pecher. The war meant many of the employees were women, above all graduates of the School of Applied Arts. Because of the imbalance between the basic requirements of daily life and the opulence of the Wiener Werkstätte's furnishings, the organization was increasingly criticized for its frivolity and inopportune choice of design. Above all, Adolf Loos, an opponent of the arts and crafts movement and the Wiener Werkstätte, said he wanted the crafts freed from the artists. In 1932, the Wiener Werkstätte went into liquidation. Josef Hoffmann was very ill for many years after 1919, and for some time had to pass on the management of his studio to Oswald Hertel. Even though his international acclaim had reached its peak, the controversy surrounding him was not to die down throughout the 20s and 30s. He suffered greatly from these disputes. He felt he had been slighted and was misunderstood. And he was often offended and reacted angrily. Still, or just because of this, Hoffmann tirelessly applied himself to the creation of new forms until his death.
Ich habe Josef Hoffmann
I knew Josef Hoffmann in the 50s from the tables reserved for artists from the Sezession. He led a kind of retired man's existence at that time. In other words, he had very few commissions. The interest in him changed somewhat in the 60s. The design of around the 1900s aroused great interest in the artists, partly inspired by America, and they began to buy and exchange furniture.
Teilweise inspiriert sogar von den Amerikanern. Und die Künstler haben sich angefangen, diese Möbeln zu kaufen, zu tauschen. Und es ist...
One often heard reports from America of how much it was appreciated.
Berichtet hat, wie groß das dort geschätzt ist worden. Das hat natürlich auch das Interesse der Künstler, die natürlich...
This, of course, made it all much more interesting. Although this demand for Hoffmann's works was not at all expected.
Dass das dann so allgemein überhaupt als Wertschätzung gefunden hat, das ist eher gar nicht so erwartet worden.
After the Second World War, Hoffmann assumed a number of official duties, while receiving fewer commissions for design. His official engagements included membership of the Art Senate, and Austrian General Commissioner for the Biennale in Venice. Hoffmann's 85th birthday turned into a real triumph. He was not only awarded a special prize in Austria, which included a large sum of money, but was also invited to Belgium with his wife, where the Stocklet family opened their house for a spectacular birthday celebration.
Abenteuer Kunstgeschichte.
Adventure art history. One could nearly say thriller art history. The cultural overturn in the first third of our century took place at a breathtaking speed. And if you are missing our thread of the plot, which we mentioned at the beginning of this film, then that's because it just doesn't exist. It cannot, as art history never runs in straight lines, but in a number of different stages which complement or overlap, or even contradict each other.
In mehreren verschiedenen, einander ergänzenden oder einander überlappenden Ebenen, die durchaus auch im Widerspruch zueinander stehen können. Wir erinnern uns an die
We remember the new objectivity of Josef Hoffmann's early designs, and parallel to that, the new surface art of Eduard Wimmer and especially of Dagobert Pecher. And the film wanted to show just that the orientation of style cannot be defined and categorized into specific years. The film also wanted to prove that each cultural epoch, and that means even now ours, has very avant-garde currents. These currents are only recognized as such by very few people. But we hope that through this film we have become more sensitive to the cultural events of our time, and for that which is now developing, which possibly will one day be considered avant-garde. Nobody can tell at the time of its birth what avant-garde is. Years later, cultural historians more or less define what avant-garde was.
Josef Hoffmann,
Josef Hoffmann, one of Austria's greatest artists and one of the most influential architects of the 20th century, died in Vienna at the age of 86. His life's work included all areas of the fine arts. As initiator of the Wiener Secession, he was a decisive influence on the drawings and paintings of his time. As a founder of the Wiener Werkstaette, he revolutionized the arts and crafts. As an eternal avant-gardist, Josef Hoffmann will always be a revered example for the Austrian artist.